Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar. My name is Janice Sabat, and I'm with Vermont Family Network. A few quick reminders before we get started. We strongly encourage you to ask questions. Please type your question in the question box and ignore the chat box. Only the presenter will see your questions. At the end of the webinar, a short survey will pop up. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out so we can make improvements and fulfill our grant reporting requirements. If you would like a certificate of completion, please send an email to Janice, Janice, .sabat, SABETT, @vtfn.org. Also, before we get started, I wanted to make you aware of some upcoming webinars. On May 9th, we're having a webinar called Person-Centered Thinking for Families. On May 14th, the webinar is called Preparing for a Healthy College Experience for Youth with Learning or Health Challenges. And on May 23rd, we'll have a webinar entitled The Power of Positive Reinforcement, Strategies for Teaching Young Children. Also, everyone should know we are continuing with our SIP Shops program in Chittenden, and this is a program for the sons and or the siblings of children who have special needs or disabilities. Our next event is on May 19th, and we're going to have a picnic. So for more information on that, you can check out all the details on our website. And now for our presenters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracie Carlson. I am with NFI Vermont. I'm here with Samantha Thomas.
Hi, everyone. Samantha Thomas. I am from Northwestern Counseling and Support Services up in St. Albans, Vermont, and we're really excited to be with you today.
A few things about us. We are, both Samantha and I are lead ARC trainers, which we'll talk a little bit about in this webinar, in the state of Vermont. And so we are able to provide trainings across the state at local DAs, special services agencies, schools, anywhere really. And we are both parents. I have two boys, and I say that because as I talk about some of these strategies, I want you to know that I am also coming from a caregiving place.
Yes, I have two boys as well, 5 months and 4 years old, and I've learned a lot about myself by becoming a parent.
Yeah. So we really did create this webinar with caregivers in mind, and we are sorry, I saw a question, not really a question. It says sound is good. Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie. And so our hope is, you know, we have a lot of information. Sam and I are talkers. We could go on for days and days, but we only have an hour. And so we hope what we put together gives a resource for you to then take and ask questions for the people that you're working with, or do some investigation of some of the things that we're going to highlight.
Absolutely. We'll also kind of scatter in a couple of resources that if you're interested in looking at after this webinar. There's some really great stuff out there on the web these days, and that's what's really exciting, is that there's a lot of research, a lot of work, and a lot of strategies available to us right at our fingertips.
Let's get started.
All right. Okay, so we're here to talk about playing, ultimately, right? The title of our webinar is It's Okay to Play. And I think sometimes that we forget that. We get kind of mired down sometimes in what's really hard and what's tough, and that the hopeful message here is that we can play while we're supporting kids who've experienced some trauma. And so when we're talking about trauma, it's important for us to come together around a definition of trauma. And there's a lot of different folks, a lot of really smart people out there that are doing great research and are defining trauma. The definition that we use here is from Margaret Blaustein and Christine Kinneberg, and they are the developers of the ARC model that Tracie referenced earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. What's important here is that it's really about events that overwhelm a person's ability to cope. And that is really, for me, and I don't know how you feel about Tracie, but that's really at the heart of it for me. And so that's the key piece, just thinking about can that person in that moment cope with what's happening to them. And the other piece is that when we're also talking about trauma, and we're talking about kind of these consequences, if you will, about trauma, we're very much talking about multiple traumatic experiences. So individuals might have one traumatic event and it is destructive, and then they're able to recover from it, or it's destructive and they need a really significant amount of support to recover from it. And there are other times where, particularly, we're talking about kids. Kids are experiencing multiple traumatic events. And when that happens, we see some differences and some really, really broad impacts in ways that we didn't know. There's so much that we've learned about how experiencing a lot of trauma, particularly in early childhood, can really impact a kid's ability to function and be in the world, and to function and be in families and in schools and in their systems. So it's important for us to recognize all of these pieces and this broad scope, right? So I think sometimes we can misunderstand kids' behavior, and that's why this information is really important for us to understand, so that we can try to really be aware of what might be going on for kids. Because when kids have had these types of multiple traumatic experiences, it shifts how they experience the world. And they might come into situations with really caring, well-intended adults. I know Tracie and I both work in mental health, and that's our passion. We want to help kids and families. We want to help individuals grow. And what we have to recognize is that sometimes that kid doesn't expect that that's our intention. They've learned that sometimes people can't be trusted, that maybe the world isn't a safe place. So their behavior is a reflection of that. It can be also really difficult to form relationships for kids who've had this type of trauma. Difficult to feel safe enough to take a risk and try to build a connection with an adult or with another kid. I know that I've been at many meetings where, families and teachers are sitting around saying, how do we help this kid get some friendships? And that's a really key place where we need to add some focus so we can support kids to understand how to build those relationships, because these early events can really hamper their ability to do that. It can also be really challenging for kids to develop a really strong sense of who they are and the positive aspects of themselves. Some kids who've experienced some real complex trauma, that's a term that we use in the field to describe these multiple traumatic events for kids, that it really can damage their sense of self. It can damage how they see themselves, and they tend to lean towards the negative. So they might expect others to be reflecting that back to them. And even sometimes they will engage in behaviors that elicit that from us, adults. And we have to be really, really mindful of that, because it can be really easy to reflect that back to kids if we're not in a space where we can be reflective. And we'll talk about that through the webinar, how we can be using some strategies so that we can be in a good place to recognize those signs and symptoms for kids. And also, there are, at the heart of things, and what I think can sometimes be the easiest piece of all of this to grab onto, is this concept of regulation. It can be really hard for kids who've experienced complex trauma to be able to regulate their internal experience. Whether you talk about it as emotions or energy. In the ARC model, we like the term energy because it takes away some of that that angst that kids, when they think about emotions, there can be a lot tied up in that. But energy makes sense to them. It's really non-threatening. It can be really difficult for kids who've experienced these early traumatic events to be able to regulate what's going on for them, what's going on. They sometimes can't identify really well what's happening for them. And so it's incumbent upon us as the adults in their lives to help them with that. And we'll talk about later as well some strategies that we can use to help kids to regulate, and also some strategies that we can use to regulate ourselves, because we'll also talk about the fact that it can be hard, it can be really challenging to be caring for, in whatever capacity, we're caring for, but particularly as family members of little ones that are really struggling, or big ones that are really struggling. Sometimes I say little ones when I'm talking about big kids because I know there's a little one in there, and they need us to be able to regulate ourselves so that we can help them to regulate. And then there are sometimes some developmental challenges that can occur when kids have had early traumatic experiences. We're going to talk a little bit about some brain science, nothing too in-depth, but just a little bit of a taste of it to understand how our brains develop and how some of these traumatic experiences can really impact how our brains develop and what our kids who've experienced complex trauma have the capacity to do in a moment when they are experiencing stress. All right, so we'll jump into some of the brain science. The exciting thing about our brains is that they are plastic. Our brains are moving. They're not moving unless we're moving around, but our brains are shaping based on our environment. We have these neurons, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not going to use the most fantastic, specific scientific language, but I have a basic enough understanding of what happens as we grow, and I think that that's really important. It's important for our kids to understand what's happening in their brains, and important for us to understand as parents what's going on in our kids' heads and what's going on in our heads so that we can really work at that regulation piece. Right, so our brains develop from the back forward. And what that means is if I'm pointing to the back of my head, I'm pointing to my brain stem. And that's the area of our brain that develops first. And it is, it's really where we are regulating most of the time, really unconsciously, some of our just bodily functions, our hunger, our temperature. We don't typically pay attention to how hot or cold we are unless there's a real significant change. But that's the parts of our brain that monitor that. And then as our brains develop forward towards the front of our heads, we start getting into our emotional centers, our amygdala, and then we move forward into our frontal cortex, our prefrontal cortex. And that's where we can really think creatively and solve problems really creatively. But what's important about all of this is that our ability to use those different parts of our brain depend on the mood we're in, the state that we're in, how maybe angry or upset or scared we are. And there's a really great guy out there, Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry. He's come to our area many times, and he does a lot of work around neuroscience. So you could Google him and you'll come up with a million resources, but I think he's childtraumaacademy.org is his main website, right, Tracie? And he has lovely videos online that can give you a much better, more in-depth presentation if you're looking, for more resources about that. But ultimately, what we've learned from Dr. Perry is that if I'm upset, if I'm angry, if I'm worked up, if I'm terrified, I'm going to be using these more, we call them primitive parts of our brain. Sometimes folks use the word lizard brain. That can be a really accessible way for kids to understand this. So if I'm really upset and worked up or nervous about doing this webinar, I might be using a more primitive part of my brain. And so that's going to be more reactive. I'm not going to be really using all of those skills that my frontal cortex offers me to really think creatively and to kind of manage my inhibitions. And that's really, really important. So if we've got a kid that's really escalated, it's important for us to remember that that kid's using that back part of their brain. So sitting with them and trying to process might not be the right fit at the moment. We're going to be looking at some of these regulating activities because we want that kid's energy level, that kid's fear, that kid's anger, whatever that is, we want to bring that back down so we can pull them out of their lizard brain. And I've heard some folks use this phrase and bring them into their wizard brain. And that's that frontal cortex where we can really think and reflect on what we've done. And so that's a really important part of this. And the other piece where we're talking about this use-dependent element is that when we've got little kiddos that have grown up in environments where there's so much trauma going on, they're really living in this back part of their brain, in this lizard part of their brain. So they may not have had a lot of opportunities to develop their wizard brain. And it's important for us knowing that, or wondering that, because sometimes we don't know, maybe what's happened for a kid, particularly if we're a foster parent and we don't yet have enough information about what's happened for a kid. We might wonder what's happened for them. It's important for us to know that and offer some opportunities to be able to develop some of that wizard brain, to develop some of those skills, but to also recognize that there can be real patterns of behavior that can be really difficult for kids to break. And that's where we get frustrated as adults because we can get escalated and then we're moving back into our lizard brain as well.
So I'll just add, when I'm providing supervision to my staff or talking to caregivers in my work, one of the things I highlight is just this really simple phrase that I sort of try to use as a mantra, which is when arousal is up, cognition is down. It's really that simple.
Yeah, absolutely.
When arousal is up, kids are in their fight, flight, or freeze mode. And we have to attend to that. So I just wanted to, if people are taking notes, that's a good one to take. And I will, we did get some feedback that our slides are hard to read. I'm not sure that we can do anything about that right now, but maybe we can fix that for what we post. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for letting us know that.
So another really smart guy out there, his name is Dan Siegel, and he's developed this kind of nifty hand model of the brain. If you Google hand model of the brain by Dan Siegel, he has a couple of, short 5-minute videos that help you to take what you have at the ready all the time to explain what we're talking about. So in the picture here, and I hope that it comes clear, but if it doesn't, like I said, Google the hand model because he does a nice job of walking folks through that. You can see the different areas of the brain where things are represented. So in the image on the right side, right, our wrist is our spinal cord. As we start to move up into kind of that meaty part of our palm and thumb, it's the brainstem, that wizard brain, if you will. And as you start to move into your thumb, we're talking about those emotion centers, and that's the limbic system in our brain. And then our top 4 fingers come down over, and that represents that prefrontal cortex that I was talking about. And what's lovely about this is kids can understand this, and it's important for each of us to understand what happens for our brains. I know that for me, it's what helped me to understand that if I have an argument with someone, why 2 hours later I go, oh, I wish I had said this. That would have been the perfect comeback. It would have been the perfect right thing to say because I was escalated and I wasn't using the full capacity of my brain in the moment. So this is a really handy way to talk about that. One of the things that is not shown here that Dan Siegel talks about in his video is that if you picture those top fingers popping up, he calls it flipping your lid. That's when those emotional centers, those lizard parts of the brain have just blown through the prefrontal cortex. We're not regulated. We're acting out. We are reacting instead of responding to what's in front of us. So that's just a nice little way to kind of make this brain science easier to understand.
Okay, so we want to do it will be a very brief overview of the ARC framework, which stands for Attachment, Regulation, and Competency. It was developed by Margaret Blaustein and Christine Kinnenberg, and they are with the Justice Resource Institute in Boston. For those of you who are familiar with Bessel van der Kolk, they have worked with him. So I want to give you a little history about ARC because about 10 years ago was the first time that Margaret had come to Vermont. Might have been a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
And she did a training. I remember it was at the Essex. Mm-hmm. I remember sitting there and I remember leaving there thinking to myself, this is brilliant. I am already doing a lot of this work. I know a lot of caregivers who are already doing this work. I know colleagues who are doing this work. And now we're going to embrace this as our trauma-informed modality in the state of Vermont because we received a grant. And I had mentioned earlier that Sam and I are lead trainers. There's multiple lead trainers out in the area right now. We were able to work under Margaret for a couple of years and learn her model really well and share it out. And we are in the process of rejuvenating that because we feel like it's lost a little bit of its what's the word? Spunk?
Steam.
Yeah, steam. And so we have a group of very dedicated people who are looking at putting on another large ARC conference. We are planning on going back down to Boston to train with Margaret again. And we have developed if you're on Facebook, we have developed the Vermont Trauma Lens, which is a great resource, not just for things happening in Vermont, but really all across the country. So if you're on Facebook and you want to join that, feel free. But let me dive into ARC a little bit. So we like to show things in a picture, right? And so for those of you who are familiar with the old ARC, we used to have what looked like a pyramid, and it was these building blocks. And things have shifted a little bit. So we're excited that we're able to give you some of the new information. But if you look at, and I hope you can see the colors, the orange, the bottom row of this ARC house, we call it, you'll see that there's engagement, psychoeducation, and routines and rituals. These are the 3 integrative strategies that we are now looking at when we're working with families to use the ARC model. So engagement is simply that. Do we explain ARC in a way that families want to engage in this type of treatment, because it is very playful. I think we can highlight that. We will be highlighting that throughout the rest of this webinar. Psychoeducation is key. So as Sam just gave you a strategy, a technique to show kids sort of how the brain is structured, things like that. Lots of resources. So the Child Academy, we use that a lot of the Bruce Perry resources that we have, just so that people understand really, truly how trauma has impacted the kids that we're working with. And then routines and rituals, which we'll delve into a little bit more, is a really important integrative strategy because it really does hold safety for kids. And like I said, we'll get into that more.
One thing, is it okay?
Yes, please.
One thing about the psychoeducation that I think is so important is that what we've learned about kids who've experienced this kind of trauma is that they feel a loss of control and a loss of a sense of agency. And so a lot of their behaviors are ways to assert control that are disruptive, that are difficult to manage sometimes, but it's the way that they are functioning and the way that they've adapted to their experience. And so having this psychoeducation as the foundation, if you will, of this house is so important, because giving kids and families, parents, grandparents, all of the folks that make up families, this information gives them a little bit of that control in a really healthy way. And so I think that piece is it's just so important.
Yeah, thanks. So our next level of the house, which is green, represents the attachment domain. The 3 blocks there are caregiver affect management, attunement, and effective response. So a little bit about each of those. Caregiver affect management is our ability as caregivers, in whatever role we're in, to modulate and regulate ourselves before we engage in a difficult situation with the youth. We'll get, and I think we're going to talk, we're going to talk more about that, I think, in the next slide. Attunement, attunement is being in a relationship and understanding what the other person is experiencing, and knowing how to understand their energy.
Yeah.
When I teach this, I talk a lot about the idea of I get you and you get me for a kid, and that's the key part with the youth that we're serving. They need to feel like they can be in a safe relationship, a healthy, safe relationship with somebody. So whether that's a caregiver, an educator, a foster parent, I mean, we could go on and on, a doctor, they just need to know that they are understood and gotten. Did you want to add something to that?
No, I think for me, sometimes it's really at its core about paying attention.
Yeah.
And being able to understand what are some of those cues about your kid that tell you what's going on, or what are some of those cues about your kid that tell you that something's going to get crazy.
Yeah. Effective response is the capacity of all the caregivers in a youth's life to provide consistent and predictable responses to behaviors. And when I talk about this in my trainings, I often reference The Explosive Child, Ross Greene. Mm-hmm. In that book, he talks a lot about taking behaviors and putting them sort of into baskets. So basket A might be, these are all the behaviors we are definitely going to address because it's a safety concern and it's important. And then basket, did I say basket A? Basket B would be the behaviors that the caregiving system around the youth want to attend to, but they're not so important, so that if they happen every once in a while, it's okay. And then basket C, which are the behaviors that no one's going to address because for whatever reason. So again, that's another good resource, is looking up Ross Greene and The Explosive Child. The next level is our regulation level. And this is probably, for me anyways, I find this to be the area where we really implement the playfulness. And so regulation speaks to affect identification, affect modulation, and relational engagement. And again, I'll explain a little bit about each of those. So affect identification is the ability for a youth to label and contextualize what they're feeling, what their energy is. That is really hard for a lot of the kids we work with because they are so misattuned to their own bodies. And again, if you're a youth who has grown up in chaos and unpredictability, and you are unable to read the moods of others, then it's hard for you to identify and label the feelings that you're having. This is also, again, wanting for our youth to understand and be able to label and contextualize the feelings of others, which is a really, really hard thing for our kids, again, because of the experiences that they've had. Modulation is the ability to regulate those feelings and to understand that you can have more than one feeling at a time, that your feelings can be big, they can be small, but that there is capacity to contain that energy, whether we need to upregulate it or downregulate it. And again, a lot of playful ways to do that, to teach to that. And then relational engagement is really simply the ability to safely express that energy, those feelings, to the right people in a way that is safe and healthy. Okay, and then our next level is competency. And the two blocks there are executive functioning and self-development and identity. And executive functioning really does speak to the ability to use the prefrontal cortex to problem solve. There are lots of ways to do that as well. I'm fumbling a little bit because I wish I could show you some of like the handouts and stuff that we have. I don't have them with me, but we can certainly get some of them. But there's some really great problem solving material out there. I know soda is one of them. The fishbone. Yep. Yeah, so that's what we use when we're working with youth. So the other key piece about executive functioning, though, is that you can't, right, when arousal goes up, cognition goes down. You can't problem solve when a kid is not regulated. So this work is typically done in therapy sessions or in skill shifts. That's what we call them at NFI when they're working with us one-on-one individually. Self-development and identity is the idea that these kids really have no idea who they are. They don't know that they have a lot of positives about themselves. They don't know that they're unique and special. Their lives have been fractured to a place where putting the pieces together is really hard. And some of them have a really hard time thinking about who they're going to be in the future. So those are the 4 target skills that we look at when we're doing any self-development and identity. This block, when we think about play and putting it into context, we do a lot of artistic music, yep. Body movement, body work, just to help kids really look at their strengths and to get to the core of who they really are in spite of the trauma that they have experienced.
I think sometimes when I'm thinking about this block in particular, it can be easier when we're supporting kids with this block to think about other people first and then start to think about themselves, because it sometimes can feel a little bit threatening for kids who have this kind of trauma to really start thinking about who am I and who am I to you, and what are all the wonderful things about me. It can be helpful to kind of start with the perspective of other folks and then kind of bring it in.
Yep, great point. Do you want to talk about trauma experience integration?
So the thing that I love about the ARC framework, well, there's a lot of things that I love about the ARC framework, but one of them is that I don't think that you couldn't apply the ARC skills, all of these blocks, into every relationship with a kid, with the exception of the top, the roof. Trauma experience integration is really helping a kid to understand really what this trauma means, how it is a part of their life course, how it's not driving who they are at their core, not driving who they're going to be. And so it's really about integrating these experiences in a really healthy way. And most of that work happens in a therapeutic relationship. But everything under that roof, you can hit in every relationship. I think that's what's wonderful, is that this isn't about just sitting in an office with a therapist and a kid. It's about everybody has an opportunity to support a kid to understand how to read other people's body language and how to understand what other people are feeling, how to understand what they're feeling, and how to reach out to express and share what they're feeling with others in a really healthy and efficient and effective kind of way. Because let's face it, our kids that have had these awful experiences, they are letting us know all the time what's going on for them, but it's in disruptive ways, or it's in really withdrawing ways. And so it's not getting them what they really, really need. So that's why I just love this framework. It makes sense, and you don't have to go from the bottom up. You can jump in anywhere. You can always do regulating activities. My son is a little bit crazy, wild, lots of energy at night, and so bedtime can be really tough. And so I just found myself, I wasn't even thinking about it. We were laying down in bed. This was when he was, I think, 2.5, maybe 3, and I could just feel his energy. And so I was like, hey, buddy, let's try something new and cool. And I taught him about some deep breathing. And he thought it was kind of fun because he was 2 and 3, and we were just kind of playing with it. And we were saying, like, how long can you hold the breath, and how long can you blow it out? And so it was fun for him to try it out. And now he's 4.5. And now sometimes I'll be like, hey, buddy, you got a lot of energy in your body. Let's take a breath. And he'll just do a, and we can kind of bring that down a little bit. Then sometimes we have to do some other activities, but it's a good start. It's a good way that we've developed to connect, to say, all right, our energy is just too high right now. We got to bring it down. And it was fun for him to give it a try. And that's why we're talking about this playfulness piece so much, because kids who've experienced trauma, they've had hard for a really long time. They deserve to have some fun in learning how to be really healthy and learning how to build all of these lovely skills that we want for them.
Yeah, thanks. So what you just highlighted by talking about your own child is that ARC really is universal.
Yes.
And while it was developed for kids who have experienced trauma, what we know is that it works for everyone. And it works across settings. Margaret has implemented ARC across the world, and in residential programs, in foster homes, in psychiatric hospitals. It's been pretty amazing. I know I used to work at a residential program, and when we implemented ARC, our seclusion and restraint rate went down, I think, 70%. So that's pretty, and there was a lot of play, and it took a long time. So I guess I want to also say that this is a little counterintuitive to the way that we think that we parent. And I'm not a perfect parent, and I would never say that to anyone. I feel like I'm good enough. That's the language we use in ARC. But when it's implemented and over time it becomes a routine and a ritual, it really does work.
Yeah, and I liked what you said, Tracie, about ARC being good for everybody, and it really is. You know, if you are in a family and you know that one of your kids needs this piece, this extra something, chances are your other kids could benefit from that. So sometimes I'll go to schools and talk to them about how to be more trauma informed using some of the ARC principles and other principles. And they'll ask me, well, but I've got a classroom of 20 kids. And I'll say, okay, a brain break or a regulating activity isn't going to hurt those 19 other kids. It's going to really help that kid that needs it, but it's also going to help those other kids to get recentered and refocused or whatever it happens to be in the moment.
Okay, so when you get on a plane, you either watch a video or a flight attendant explains to you as the adult, if you're traveling with a child, that if something were to happen and the oxygen masks come down, you put yours on first. And the reason for that is because you need to be able to take care of the little people that you're with. Okay, so this is speaking to caregiver affect management and some strategies that we try to implement when we're in the middle of a difficult situation so that we can better understand and meet the needs of the youth that we're working with. So, and we're going to sort of be a little redundant about this, but you'll see why. So the first thing we want to try to do is to just sort of stand back and observe that behavior. Now, what that looks like can look different for lots of different people. You know, when I'm observing, I'm being really curious. And you'll see the next bullet says, be curious, not furious. That's a really hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. You know, I was telling Sam that my routines and rituals got all thrown off this morning. So my 8-year-old has braces, which is really not common, and it has been quite traumatic for him, to be totally honest. And we went in yesterday not knowing that they were going to adjust his braces and they were going to tighten them. And the doctor sort of looked at me and whispered, he's going to probably be in some pain tomorrow. And he was. So this morning when I was trying to get our, family out the door, he was crying and he was very agitated, and he said, I'm not going to school, my teeth hurt. And I got a little mad. I was like, no, I'll give you Advil. You're going to school. Like, this is what we're going to do. And then he got really emotional. And so I paused and I remembered, I'm going to be more curious about this. And he was able to say to me, I can't eat. Like, I know I'm not going to be able to eat. They hurt that bad. And I feel like I'm going to not be able to listen as well because they hurt that bad. And I took a moment and I thought, you know what? In the whole scheme of things, missing one day is really not that big of a deal. Except I have to get out the door because I have a webinar and now my whole routine is up. But anyways, just to point out that, it's little things where we can just take a pause. That could have become a huge fight between he and I, and it has in the past. So again, just an example. I also try to carry around a mantra when I'm doing trainings or when I'm providing supervision to my staff, and that is, as caregivers, we need to remember that these behaviors are communication. It's a form of communication. It's not a great one. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it gets really out of control, but it's a communication that something is wrong. I have an unmet need. And so remembering that, again, when arousal goes up, cognition goes down, we want to be like a feelings detective. That's the language we use in ARC. We really want to understand where this behavior is coming from. So some strategies to do that are I encourage people to journal or to write down what that experience was like, what was happening for both the caregiver and that youth, so post sort of the incident or whatever, just to sort of really be looking deeper into triggers and into patterns of behavior that we can then really address from a responsive versus reactive, our next bullet, of way. So some other strategies that we talk about in caregiver affect management is self-care. And what we encourage people to do is sort of take a break from, if you can, we recognize that could be really hard, to take a break, to either tap out with somebody else or to say, I'm going to go take a 5-minute break. I'll come back and we'll see where we're at, that kind of thing, if it's safe enough. I also encourage people to drink some water and to eat some food, because that's something that I think people, when we're in the midst of a difficult situation, we don't take care of our bodies in that way. Play a game. with that youth, if it makes sense. And I know sometimes people will say to me, well, you're just rewarding bad behavior. And I don't see it that way. I see it as, nope, I'm actually bringing down that energy that Sam talked about earlier, and I'm attuning. So that game could be something as simple as Simon Says, as mirroring, and the list goes on. And I would love to hear from some of you what some of the strategies you have used, and we will share them out with the rest of the group. I also find that time and space for kids works really well, and that is something that is really hard, and it's literally, it could be minutes and it could be hours, but giving kids that time to self-regulate, to think about, to engage their prefrontal cortex is imperative. And there are kids that we were like, bam, yep, that's what we're going to do every time, and it works. And then there are kids that don't need that, and they're able to come back really quickly. So,
and I think that this element of self-care and making sure that you're really paying attention to what are the things that help you to regulate, that's a journey that I've taken, figuring out what my cues are and the strategies that I use, is that sometimes, like Tracie said, there isn't a lot of time because maybe there's something that's really unsafe that's going on. And so it might just be a short, small moment to take a breath. And I think that that's really important. I don't think we pay attention to that a lot in our day-to-day because we're busy, we're running. In our culture, we don't pay a lot of attention to that. But I know that for me, if I'm able to take one deep breath, it slows me down. It allows me to be more in that wizard brain, to be able to think, okay, what do I need to do in this situation? And I'm going to have a better response versus the reaction that I would have if I didn't take that moment to take a breath. And I might do something that I regret and I feel bad about later.
Yep. So again, just some examples of regulating activities that you can do for yourself. You can do in conjunction with the youth that you are engaged with. I'm going to highlight movement. Sam's already sort of talked about breathing, which is, the number one way to regulate the body. Mm-hmm. And there's so many. You know what? I forgot to mention that you all have your Google PhD. We're giving that to you right now. There are so many great videos, YouTube videos, any of these things that you Google, you can find ways to implement them. I used a meditation video for a while that I thought was really helpful for me because I find meditation very difficult.
Yeah. There's a website called gonoodle.com. And it's great. It's really good. It's a little bit geared more towards the younger ones, the littler kids, but it's a really great resource. I found out about it, and then I found out that the teachers in my son's preschool class were using it because he was coming home and doing these regulating activities that I was learning about for my work. And I thought, this is so cool and super accessible.
And for those of you who have ever read or seen Bruce Perry's NMT evals, I know that people around the state are doing them. He often will highlight these types of activities to help engage kids.
He talks a lot about rhythm.
Yeah.
And rhythm being, I would say that he would say that it's essential to our day-to-day. Right. And that getting that rhythm in any kind of a way, whether it's as simple as tossing a ball back and forth to help regulate, it helps to build a connection. We're social beings. We have an internal drive to have connection. And so sometimes it's as simple as just tossing a ball back and forth. Sometimes if you have the resources, it could be drumming or music. Lots of ways to get rhythm into interactions and to have fun with it. I can't emphasize that enough. Kids are going to engage more if it's fun.
Okay, so in ARC, we have what we call observe, modulate, do. So Sam and I will take you through that a little bit. But again, this is a little redundant, but the first thing when you're helping support youth regulation is to notice what's happening for yourself, what's happening in your body, what's happening in your mind, what's happening in the environment around you. So really to understand your own cues so that you can be available to help the youth. Then you want to observe your child, and like we talked about earlier, be a feelings detective, look at those clues, look at the triggers, and as you're doing this, and increasingly try to get in front of these behaviors by anticipating the pattern. So that's where the journaling and or the keeping a log of these behaviors comes in really handy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so observe, modulate is the next one. So I think we've talked about this. So finding your in-the-pocket strategies for how you are going to manage yourself. And I want to go back to what we talked about. Modulation isn't about changing what you're feeling. It's about managing what you're feeling. So you can be a really upset parent and you can have that in check. And you just need to figure out how you can do that for yourself. And again, lots of strategies out there. You have to find the ones that work for you. Okay. So this notion of co-modulation, so you're modulated, you've observed, you know that you can now be in it with that child who may still be pretty heightened, but with your ability to modulate yourself, you can now engage in an opportunity, or you can engage in an activity, I should have said, that will help with regulation. And I feel like we've named many of those at this point. Okay, and so the do. So it's observe, modulate, do. So the do is when the dust has settled, and if it's appropriate, that's when you want to reflect, and you potentially need to limit set, and that could be a well, I don't want to use the word consequence. That could be an understanding of that behavior is not acceptable and why. Because we don't want to waste our time, right? When arousal is up, cognition's down, we don't want to be doing this when kids can't hear. Does everybody know the Charlie Brown teacher? Well, I can't hear you, but you know the Charlie Brown teacher. That is what kids are hearing when we are trying to problem solve with them when they're in their, what's the word? Lizard brain. Sorry. Okay.
Well, and I think one of the things that we've talked about too is this idea in modulation of upregulating versus downregulating. Some kids get dysregulated and it's really obvious. It's external. Yeah. They're flipping chairs. They're telling us to do all kinds of things. Maybe they're harming themselves. You can see what's going on. So we need to really bring that down. So those down-regulating activities. But there are some kids that because of what they've experienced, they've learned to adapt and they withdraw. And that can be hard to identify. That's where that attunement piece is important to really pay attention to. Okay, they're calm, but are they with me? Are they here with me, or are they, just present? And that's where those upregulating activities come in.
Yeah. So I'm just noticing the time, 12:45, and I know we want to leave a few minutes. So we're gonna get through these slides. Okay.
Yeah. This is just a great little model. I like it. It talks about how to co-regulate, co-modulate. You can interchange those words. But it's a good little, we need to focus on, are we creating a relationship, right? I said before, we're social beings. What are we doing to foster the relationship? Who are we? Are we providing kindness and warmth? After we've done our own stuff to manage if we're angry about a situation, are we engaging in that way? Are we teaching them skills? Are we coaching them on skills? Are we showing them by the skills that we're using how to do this? Modeling is really, really key and really, really important. And then are we structuring the environment? It's important for us when we're talking about kids with trauma to look at, have we created an environment that's safe for them? Or do we have an environment that might be really triggering? I just like this little, it's just a nice way to kind of inhabit.
It's a good visual.
Co-regulation piece.
Yeah. So routines and rituals is one of the integrative strategies. And why they're important is because we know that kids who have experienced trauma, it's chaos and it's unpredictability, and there are no routines. There's no time to get up in the morning or time to go to bed for some kids. And so we want to increase that because we know that routines provide a safe environment because things are predictable. Kids know what to expect. And when kids know what to expect, they are then able to modulate their energy because they don't have to be in fight or flight. They don't have to be in their lizard brain. They can move to their wizard brain. Routines also support connection because what we know about routines and rituals is that a lot of them are based in togetherness. And, you know, whether it's family birthdays or holidays, or if it's just simply, like I said, the morning routine of getting up at a certain time and sharing breakfast together. So opportunities to implement routines and rituals is huge. But the key here is we don't want to be over structured. This is really simply more of the idea of predictability and expectation.
Yeah. And I think this is another place where playfulness can come in very much. The routine doesn't have to feel like this really regimented, you will do this at this time. It can really be about playfulness and connection and relationship. That when you say goodbye in the morning, you do a funny handshake or, you know, whatever that is that makes it fun. That can really help kids to really appreciate and enjoy that structure and that predictability.
Okay, I think we're down to our last two slides. So playfulness, there is another great resource. His name is Steve Gross. He is the director of Playmakers Association, which is, again, down in Boston. It's part of the Life is Good, I don't know, campaign or whatever they are. And he has some really great, I actually wanted to show you one, but I felt like it was going to take too much time. But he's got some great YouTube videos. If you Google him, again, Steve Gross, and Google around playfulness, that talks about these 4 elements of why play is so important. And again, I'm not going to get into great detail, but play creates a joyful environment. Look around when kids are playing, they're typically smiling. They are happy. And the kids we work with, some of them didn't get those opportunities when they were little. And so it's okay to give them to them now. And for me, it doesn't matter what age they are. I hear often, I'm not going to play with like a 17-year-old. I'm like, why? I want to play. I'm 45. Like everybody should be playing because it's fun. It also provides that social connection. So again, opportunities that some of the kids that we work with or caring for didn't get because they were isolated or because they were kicked out of daycares or after school programs. It also provides the internal control, which is what we know all kids want, is the ability to control. So they can control their play. And it gives them active engagement. They are in the moment. They are present, which is, again, is a lot of the kids that we work with struggle with that. Being here now is what Steve Gross would say. And then just a final resource that we wanted to make sure you knew about, because it is also, I know that there's a lot of practitioners who use the PACE model from Dan Hughes. And I'm not trained in it, so this was strictly just to give you this as a resource, as a strategy. That PACE stands for positive, playful, accepting, curious, collaborative, and empathic relationships. So what Dan Hughes says about play is that it can be a successful antidote to stress. It helps strengthen the critical brain systems involved in attachment, and it generates hope and expands a child's competency and creativity. So I don't have the names of specific providers who are using PACE, but certainly you can, if you're wondering, you can ask around.
Yeah.
Or
absolutely.
I know that there is the Vermont Psychology or whatever, the Psychology Today website often will list what people's specialties are. So, okay, so it looks like we have some questions. My kids often become unregulated when we're driving in the car. What strategies would you suggest? Oh, that's great. Dance party, singing party, something playful. We find actually that, well, I would also back up and I'd want to understand more about what is it about being in the car. So back to that feelings detective, curious, not furious. And I also know that dysregulated kids in the car can be a safety issue. So you need to be thinking about that. But if you can get them into that playful, what's their favorite song? Can you create a routine and a ritual around car rides? Gosh, I feel like there's so many. Want to add any?
No, I think understanding what it is that's making the car ride difficult, like you said, is really important. And are there ways to combat that? are there ways to give the kids what they need based on whatever it is that's causing that car ride to be difficult? And finding fun things to do. I think we've all been in the car on a long ride and had kids, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And then much more unsafe behaviors, offering things for them to do, making it as fun as you can, because then it's really fun for everybody.
It's just making me laugh a little bit because I have a friend who just yesterday chaperoned a 7th, 8th grade field trip down to Boston. And within 10 minutes, she was like, what was I thinking? There was multiple complaints that there was no Wi-Fi on the bus. Okay. I'm often with my 2 boys alone when one attacks the other, when he becomes overwhelmed. What can a parent do when they are alone and in this situation?
I think sometimes, as much as possible, for a lot of situations, pre-planning. You don't always know what's going to happen, but sometimes you can always know that something's going to happen, or, kind of be prepared for the worst, but hope for the best, plan for the best. And so setting up some expectations, some limits, some consequences ahead of time, some processes that work. Is there one child that is in a regulated enough place that you can get them moved off to a safe place where they can be engaged in another activity while you can turn your attention on your child that is really dysregulated and unsafe? Those are some of my initial thoughts. I don't know what you think, Tracie.
You know what? I was reading more questions, so I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, so another question just came in. Are there any kinds of play or type activities that should be avoided for a child that has experienced trauma? It does make sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Whew. Sort of, for me,
I think what hits me first is the answer to this question will depend on how well you know the child and what this child has experienced. So if I'm a foster parent who's just received a child into my home, or it's even been a couple of weeks or a couple of months, if I'm still getting to know this child, I'm not going to engage in play where I put my hands on the child, because I don't know how they're going to react to that. I don't know what they've experienced. Hands-on might be very triggering. So that, for me, is kind of the first thing that comes up. That if you don't know, I would say hands off, engage in something that hopefully catches their interest. And sometimes we're trying our best. We're kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall. Some of the strategies that we choose are going to stick and some aren't. So for me, I think that when it comes to kind of safety and a gut reaction is hands off until you know that hands on is okay.
So she just added that she is a therapeutic, she's asking the question for therapeutic support staff in a preschool setting.
Gotcha. Yep, I think that would still stand until I know if a kid can handle, if parents are okay with any kind of a hands-on activity. I would definitely keep hands off. But like I said, I can't keep plugging this Go Noodle website enough. It's really silly, particularly for a preschool population. They can just kind of get the sillies out and in a really fun and creative way.
Yeah. So I guess what I would add is, we don't have a lot of time to reflect on, but when I think about kids in play, there are some things that kids just won't do.
Yep.
And they know themselves well enough to give you that message that I can't do that type of play. And it doesn't really matter why. We can make assumptions. And we don't force kids to do, I don't know. I don't have a really great example. Maybe swimming. Maybe we've got kids who will say, I just can't go swimming. And we say, we honor that.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though we know swimming is again, a great body movement activity and really, kids in water, man.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, grumpy kids, you put them in water, right? Yeah. The 3 people here we're all shaking our heads.
And you can start small. I think when I go back to the breathing, I just always go back to breathing because it doesn't cost anything. You don't have to have anything for it. You can practice it. With little ones, you can practice breathing with, we call it buddy breathing. And if a kid's comfortable, they can lie down on the ground and have a stuffed animal on their abdomen, and it helps to teach them how to do a nice deep belly breath. You can put it on their chest so that you can tell where is that little buddy rising and falling. Kids kind of really like that, so they can actually see what's happening. They're learning how to do that breathing piece.
Yep.
Okay, I think we have time. One more question.
Yep.
This is a really important question. I'm a parent with a trauma background and my kids trigger me. How can I initiate play when I'm struggling to regulate my own emotions? We see this all the time. All the time. Parents will stare at me blankly and say, you want me to play? I can barely manage myself and you want me to play. And so I get that's really hard. How do we tackle that?
My gut is what are the skills and the regulating activities that you need to be able to bring yourself into a calmer place. And that's easy for me to say. It's a heck of a lot harder to do in the moment.
Yeah.
But you will feel more playful. You'll be able to access that playfulness if you've taken care of yourself and done those strategies, whatever it looks like, holding something in your pocket, rubbing a nice piece of cloth, smelling something nice, taking a breath. Sometimes even just taking a step back, a physical step back in a situation can kind of help to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about is building the capacity for self-care first, because you don't want the play to be not genuine or not fun. Mm-hmm. Kids pick up on that really quickly, and we know that.
Yeah.
So I think I would work with the caregiver to find ways to be playful for themselves before they can initiate that play with their child. And in the meantime, I would hope that other people are being playful with kids. And so it goes back to the entire caregiving system, being available to engage with kids in this way, because we know that we're strengthening their core system, their core energy system.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's all of our questions for today. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for our webinar today. I encourage you to visit our website at vermontfamilynetwork.org, where you'll find a lot of resources. All of our upcoming webinars and our past webinars are all on our website. We are going to archive this webinar with our 90-plus webinars on our website and our YouTube channel. And of course, if you ever want to give us a call, we'd love to hear from you. You can call us toll-free at 1-800-800-4005. And have a great day.